In this video, we are going to install RackForms on a GoDaddy Windows hosting account. It's important to note that although this video is specific to GoDaddy and specific to Windows hosting, a lot of these concepts are actually applicable to other hosting setups as well. For example, Linux will have some of the same basic steps. That said, though, again, this is specific for Windows. We have other documentation for other systems. With that, then, let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do after our website has been set up is essentially greeted with a screen that looks like this. Let me actually hide this guy. It'll basically look like this. It'll say what our domain name is, some information about our database server, and so on. The first thing that we want to do is create a database for RackForms to use. Now, to make this video go a little bit smoother, I've actually already done that, but the process is very simple. I simply go to this section of the screen and say Add New Database, and then I'm taken to a screen where I'll define the database properties for this particular user. So you'll notice that the database name then usually has a prefix, so we can change this, and then we'll create a database username along with a password and then confirm that password. Now, it is important to note that when we do this, that we save the values so that we can use them for the RackForms installer. One of the tricks that I actually like to use is I never type values twice. I only type them once, and then I copy and paste them between a notepad or scratchpad of some sort so that I don't have any entry errors. The other thing that helps me do is make sure that I create strong passwords. So for example, I'll make sure that I'm using punctuation and numbers and letters, and they're at least 14 characters long. That said, though, I already have a database created, and I have its user details sitting on a little notepad document that I'm going to use to, again, copy and paste as I perform the install process. I think if I hit cancel here, we'll actually go and we can actually see here now that this is the name of the database that I have. It is actually interesting to note here, it's a nice perk of how GoDaddy handles their database servers, that we can actually access this server right here through our SQL Server Management Studio. So if I go ahead and bring my Windows Virtual Desktop over, I can actually see here in SQL Server Management Studio that I can actually access this database right here, and then I can actually pop open the store procedures and the database tables that are being used in that instance. And of course, this makes development really, really simple for a lot of tasks. It's easy to create backups and to create and work with database tables using Server Management Studio. So it's a nice little perk that we have. Now, that said, it is important to note also that we don't necessarily need to use MS SQL when we have Windows hosting on GoDaddy. We can just as easily create a MySQL database, and the creation process for that is essentially the same. I'd say add new database, only now instead of saying MS SQL from this drop-down, I would actually say, well, in this case, it's defaulting to MySQL because I have a basic plan right here, so I have no choice but to use a MySQL database. But if this is the first database I created, I could actually say, yes, I want this to be MySQL or MS SQL. That said, though, we have a database created, so let's actually talk about files. So in my main panel right here, I'm going to go ahead and click on Files, and I essentially need to take the rackforms.zip file that we download from the download site and get it onto the server. Now, what's nice about this, again, is that we actually have a way of doing that very simply. I simply go to my File section, I click Upload Files. I then go into my desktop, I select the rackforms.zip file, I'll click Open, and it will now upload to the server. With the files uploaded then, we are going to be greeted back at our main file screen right here. And in this case, you'll notice I'm actually in HTTP docs right here. I should have mentioned that earlier, that usually in order to serve files, we want to be in this folder right here. Though it is important to note that we can actually change the name of this, but by default, it should be called HTTP docs. So now we need to unzip this file. So I'm going to go ahead and check this box right here, and I'm going to go up to More and Extract Files. It asks if we want to place it into the HTTP docs folder. We do. And we don't need to check Replace Existing Files because this is the first time we're uploading it. So I'll just go ahead and click OK. This process usually takes a minute or two to perform. There's a lot of files in that folder, but when it's done, we'll once again be greeted at the File Manager location here in our HTTP docs folder, and we should now have a folder called RackForms. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to delete the rackforms.zip file. We don't need this on the server anymore. So I'll go ahead and click Remove. And now we're ready to set file permissions, though it is interesting to note that at this point we can actually reach the installer. So if I go ahead and navigate over to demo.rackforms.com, the default page of this site is actually nothing right now. It's just a blank image, though I should be able to type the address where the RackForms installer sits, in this case /RackForms, and I should be greeted by the installer itself. So the one really important thing that I actually need to do now is I need to make sure that I have the correct file permission set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the file manager here, and I'm going to go into the RackForms folder, and I need to basically say that the web user, that is the application user, the application pool rather, has access to the output folder and then 2 files within the app. So let's go ahead and do output first. So I'm going to kind of mouse over output, and I'm going to go to this little drop down and say change permissions. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the icon here. It says application pool group, and this value may change right here, though it should always be called application pool group. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say full control for this checkbox right here, and then I'm going to say OK. Then I'm actually going to go back into the output again, and I'm going to select change permissions here. And I'm going to make sure to check the replace permission entries on all child objects with the entries displayed here. In other words, we want to make sure that this application pool group right here, these permissions apply to all the children. Now, the reason why I did this step twice is the first time I actually tried this, I ran into, it seemed like a bug where child permissions weren't actually carried over. So doing it a second time seemed to help. Though it may not actually hurt to actually go into output right here, select one of these folders, in this case, let's just say forms, go into change permissions, and just make sure that the application pool group has been assigned full control, which in this case it has. So seeing that that's done now, I'm going to bounce up one more directory, and I go into the app directory. So we're starting at the RackForms folder. Here's the output folder we're just working on. Now we're going to go into app, and I'm going to say that this file right here, config.php, is once again going to have full permissions. So go into change permissions, and under application pool group, I'm going to select it and say full control. Click OK. It is important to note that now that we're doing single files, we actually don't need to check that box where we apply to all children. These are just single files. Then I'm going to go into move files. So we touched config. Now we're going to go into move files. And there's one more file called config.php right here. And once again, when we perform the same step, I'm going to click change permissions. And I'm going to say that application pool group has full control. And so I'll click OK. Now at this point, our files should have the proper permissions set up on them. Now it's just a matter of taking the installer and actually running the install process. Now unfortunately, sometimes our mileage unfortunately varies at this step. So I'm actually going to go ahead and hit refresh here to make sure that our installer is loaded properly. There seems to be a little variability here with the hosting environment that IAS has set up for us on GoDaddy. So there seems to be an issue with using Firefox, which we're using right now, to actually run the installer. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my information right here, and I'm going to hopefully not get any errors. But if we do get errors, we'll see how we can work around those. I did want to point out one thing though, which is if I actually go back to my file manager right here and go into the HTTP docs folder, you'll notice that I actually have a web.config file. What I want to do is I want to edit this guy real quick in the text editor and just show you here that we actually have a few default settings right here that can sometimes help us have an easier time running RackForms. Now in this case I'm using a demo version of RackForms, I should say a test build. So I'm actually going to delete this bit right here because this is actually causing us some font errors. Though it is important to note that whatever version that you download will not actually need to have this step right here. Though it is important to note that if you are using Windows hosting, the web config file is an incredibly important and powerful file that if it's not set up properly, in this case it probably wasn't set up 100% properly, we can actually run into some really serious issues with the RackForms installer process. So now you notice that I removed those lines, I actually have a different look right here. So Just be wary of those things. And if you run any issues, just shoot us an email. We can certainly help you try to track down some of those potential pitfalls. At this point then, what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to now take the values that I had previously assigned for my database. I'm going to copy and paste those into these fields. First though, I'm going to make the choice on what database vendor I want. So as I mentioned at the top here, all three of these choices will actually work so long as you created a database for them. In other words, we can use MS SQL as we're going to do right here, or we can use MySQL if we created a MySQL database. Again though, for here, I'm going to use MS SQL. And now essentially, I'm going to copy and paste in the values that I previously assigned. So here's my database name. I have my database username. And then I have the password for the database. Now the database host is actually really important. This is actually going to be an IP address right here. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in. Where we actually get that is if I go back to websites and domains and I select database. Let me actually back out of this right here. If I go into databases right here, apologies for that, you actually see that this database server column has an IP address. It's also important to note that this is how we actually access our database using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. I simply hit connect, and then for the new connection, I will put in this IP address as my location, as my host, and then I'll use the username and password, same as I was just pasting in here, as the login for that. But it is really important to make sure, again, that we have this host value as that IP address that we show in this field right here. With that said, then I'm going to go ahead and create a very simple login just for the purpose of this video, test and test. I'm going to put in my email right here, and then for my server time zone, it's really important that we select the time zone that the server is sitting in. So in this case, it's Phoenix because it's GoDaddy. If you don't actually set this, or you set it to a different time zone, a lot of your submissions to your forms are going to have the wrong time. So it's always important to set your time zone again to where the server resides in. You'll see here that we have a tooltip that actually reminds us of that. With that then, I'm going to just check over all my fields again so I could see my database vendor, my name, username, all this stuff looks good right here. My username and password is something that I'm going to remember in this case, and I set my server time zone correctly. Now here again is where your mileage may vary a little bit. Again, it seems like GoDaddy has some pretty interesting settings sometimes for how the server responds to the installer process. We're definitely working with GoDaddy to try to iron some of these out. But what we'll see here is even if this process looks like it fails, it actually has succeeded. So I'm going to go ahead and hit install right now, and I'm going to get a 500 internal server error. So what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to drag my SQL Server Management Studio open, and I'm actually going to hit under Store Procedures, Refresh, and under Tables, Refresh as well. You can actually see here that where these were once empty, the installer actually went ahead and created all these tables for us right here. So the installer's process actually worked fine here. And the other thing that I can actually check then is if I go back to my file manager now, so under Websites and Domains, or excuse me, under Files, I probably could have taken the shortcut right there. If I go into the app file, or app folder right here, I should see that the config.php file should actually have a size. In this case, it does, which means that the file has actually been written to. So it's a little bit unfortunate this happens right here, but the good news is that the server actually did complete the steps of the install process. So I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm actually going to go back up to the RackForms folder and take the install.php file right here, and I'm going to rename it to install.php.old. I'll click OK to that. And now essentially what we've done is we've told RackForms that the installer file doesn't exist anymore, and that means when we hit the /RackForms folder, it's going to hopefully load the index page for us, and it does. And again, you see a little bit of funniness going on there. Again, we're working with GoDaddy. Hopefully we can iron some of those issues out. But at this point then, I should be able to log in with my username and password, in this case test and test. And we can see the editor comes up right here. And then because I use test and test for my username and password, I'm going to go ahead and under user management, I'm going to make sure I immediately supply a much more difficult password. So So I'm just going to type in some random values here for a password, and I'll hit update account. And this way my account is secured, and usually I'd actually change my username as well. But at this point now, we have a fully installed RackForms editor. So I can go ahead and go into the editor right here, and I can save forms as I normally would. Of course, it is important to mention that by default, most browsers are going to try to block pop-up windows. So make sure that if you don't get anything when you hit save right here, that we've enabled pop-ups on our browser. But that said, as soon as the build process is done, we're going to have our completed form, and we should be all set. Again, there's a lot of variability in this process, so if you run into any issues, we do a free installation service. So simply give us an email or a call, and we will be able to install for you. But in the end, we will have something that looks just like this, a fully functional instance of RackForms on a GoDaddy Windows host.